What I did say, because I still want some left to myself.
Yeah.
And still do. But I shared.
Everyone thought they knew Elvis Presley, but Priscilla Presley just opened the door to his secret world. After decades of mystery and gossip, she confirmed the stories fans have been whispering about for years. What was really going on behind the scenes with the king of rock and roll? Join us as we reveal the truth. The secret Priscilla Presley, buried in her heart for decades. Priscilla Presley had always been known for her grace under pressure. Throughout her life, she carried herself with quiet dignity, a woman who chose her words carefully and her battles even more carefully. She was gentle by nature, preferring peace over conflict, kindness over confrontation. Those who truly knew her understood that beneath the polished exterior lived a heart that felt everything deeply, a spirit that valued loyalty above all else. She was the kind of person who would rather bear a burden alone than trouble others with her pain. Her strength was not the loud, demanding kind, but the silent, enduring type that holds families together through storms. She loved deeply, forgave even when it hurt, and protected those she cared about with fierce devotion. For decades, she had been the keeper of memories, the guardian of a legacy that belonged not just to her, but to the entire world. Yet some memories weighed heavier than others. Some truths felt too fragile, too dangerous, too sacred to share, and so she kept them locked away, sealed behind the same gentle smile that had captivated millions. But silence has a way of growing heavier with time. And now, after so many years, something inside Priscilla was shifting. The walls she had built around certain memories were beginning to crack. What she had promised herself to never speak about was pushing its way to the surface, demanding to be acknowledged, to be heard, to finally be free. The halls of Graceland had always held echoes, footsteps of visitors who came to celebrate a legend, whispers of fans who wanted to touch something that once belonged to their hero, laughter from memories that refused to fade. But on certain quiet evenings, when the tours ended and the crowds disappeared, Graceland became something else entirely. It became a place where the past lived and breathed, where every corner held a story, and where Priscilla found herself confronting ghosts she had tried so hard to leave behind. She walked slowly through the familiar rooms, her fingers trailing along walls that remembered everything. This house had witnessed joy and heartbreak, triumph and tragedy, love and loneliness. It knew secrets that the world would never believe, and lately, those secrets felt less like distant memories and more like urgent truths that refused to stay buried. There were signs. There had always been signs. Small moments that seemed insignificant at the time, but grew larger in hindsight. Conversations that ended too abruptly. Looks that carried too much meaning. Silences that spoke louder than words. The world saw Elvis Presley as a man who had everything, a king who ruled his domain with charisma and confidence. But Priscilla had seen something different. She had witnessed the man behind the legend, the human being behind the myth, the frightened soul behind the dazzling smile. She remembered how he would sometimes wake in the middle of the night, sitting up suddenly as if pulled from a nightmare. How he would stare at nothing, his breathing heavy, his hands trembling slightly. How he would get up and wander through the house, unable to settle, unable to rest, carrying something dark and heavy that he could never quite put down. She would watch him from the doorway, wanting to reach out, wanting to help, but knowing that some burdens are too personal, too painful, too complex to share. Everyone spoke about his generosity, his talent, his magnetism. They talked about his performances that made hearts race, and his voice that could move souls. They celebrated his success and mourned his struggles with fame. But there were other struggles, deeper ones, that nobody talked about because nobody knew, or perhaps because nobody wanted to know. The truth is often less comfortable than the legend. Priscilla had learned early in their relationship that loving Elvis meant accepting contradictions. He was confident, yet insecure, giving yet guarded, surrounded by people yet profoundly lonely. He could light up a room with his presence but retreat into darkness when the lights went out. He craved connection, but feared exposure. He wanted to be understood, but was terrified of being truly seen. There was one night that changed everything for Priscilla. One moment when the carefully constructed walls came down, and she glimpsed the truth that Elvis had been hiding, perhaps even from himself. It was not a dramatic revelation, not some grand confession accompanied by tears and theatrics. It was quieter than that, more honest, more raw. They were alone, the house was still, and the weight of unspoken things finally became too heavy to carry. Elvis had been unusually quiet that evening, not the comfortable silence they often shared, but something heavier, more troubled. She could see it in the way he moved, in the distant look in his eyes, in the tension that held his shoulders tight. She had learned over the years not to push, not to demand explanations, but to simply be present, to offer space for whatever wanted to emerge. "Do you ever wonder," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper, "what it costs to be what everyone needs you to be?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with meaning, heavy with years of hidden struggle. Priscilla remained still, sensing that this was a door opening, a glimpse into something he had kept locked away for too long. He continued, his words coming slowly, carefully, as if each one mandated courage to speak. He talked about expectations that felt impossible to meet, about a version of himself that the world demanded but that exhausted him to maintain. He spoke of fears that had nothing to do with career or success, but with something deeper, something more fundamental about who he was and who he was allowed to be. He revealed pressures that came not from the outside world, but from within, from parts of himself he had learned to hide, to suppress, to deny. As he spoke, Priscilla felt her heart breaking for this man she loved, this person who carried so much more than anyone realized. She understood in that moment that his life had been a performance, not just on stage, but everywhere, all the time. That the burden of being Elvis Presley was far greater than the privilege. Behind every smile, every song, every public appearance, there existed a private battle that nobody witnessed, nobody acknowledged, nobody truly understood. He shared with her fears about his own mind, about the way certain thoughts felt foreign and frightening. He confessed to feelings he had never been allowed to express, desires he had learned to bury, aspects of his identity that the world of his time would never accept. He revealed the loneliness of living a life where authenticity felt dangerous, where being fully himself seemed impossible, where even those closest to him could never know the complete truth. Priscilla listened, her gentle heart breaking and healing simultaneously. She understood that what Elvis was giving her was not just information, but trust. He was sharing the weight he had carried alone, the secret that had shaped his life in ways both visible and invisible. And she made a choice in that moment, a choice that would define decades to come. She would protect this truth. She would guard this vulnerability. She would keep this secret safe, because that was what love demanded, what loyalty mandated, what his memory deserved. But now, all these years later, Priscilla found herself questioning that choice. The world had changed. Understanding had grown. Conversations that once seemed impossible were now happening everywhere. And perhaps, just perhaps, the time had come to honor Elvis not by protecting the legend, but by revealing the truth. The complete truth. The human truth. The truth that might finally allow his soul to rest and his story to be understood in all its complicated, beautiful, painful reality. What happened that night that made Priscilla carry this burden alone for so long? What did Elvis reveal that felt too dangerous to share? And why, after decades of silence, does she now feel compelled to speak? The life no one knew he lived. Priscilla Presley possessed a heart that understood suffering without judgment. She was patient, compassionate, and fiercely loyal. But most of all, she understood that the world often demanded people be less complex than they truly were. And she hated that cruelty with quiet intensity. Living with Elvis meant witnessing two completely different realities existing at once. There was Elvis, the world adored, the man who owned every stage he stepped on, whose voice could make thousands of people feel alive. That Elvis moved with confidence, smiled like he had conquered the universe, and carried himself like royalty. But then there was the other Elvis, the one only she truly knew. That man was fragile, exhausted, and desperately trying to hold himself together behind closed doors. The public saw glittering concerts and magazine covers. They saw the expensive cars, the mansion, the devoted fans screaming his name. They believed they knew him because they had watched him perform, because they had bought his records, because they felt connected to his music. But they had no idea what it cost him to be their hero. They did not see what happened when the curtains closed and the crowds went home. "Sometimes I feel like I'm disappearing," Elvis told her one quiet afternoon, his voice tired in a way that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. "Like the person I actually am is getting smaller and smaller, and this thing everyone expects me to be just keeps getting bigger." Priscilla remembered those words often in the years that followed. She remembered the look in his eyes when he said them, the heaviness in his shoulders, the defeat in his posture. This was a man who had achieved everything society told him to want, yet felt trapped by his own success. The fame that millions envied had become his prison, and the persona the world celebrated had become his burden. Behind the king's smile lived constant fear. Fear of disappointing people who had placed impossible expectations on him. Fear of failing to live up to an image that felt increasingly unnatural. Fear of being discovered as something other than what everyone believed him to be. Elvis carried pressures that had nothing to do with album sales or movie contracts. His struggles ran deeper, touching the very core of who he was as a human being. He battled with his own mind in ways he could barely explain. There were thoughts that frightened him, feelings that seemed wrong because the world of his time offered no space for them to exist. He lived in an era when men were supposed to be one particular way, when any deviation from that narrow definition brought shame and rejection. Elvis felt things he had been taught were unacceptable, wrestled with aspects of himself that society condemned, carried desires and confusions that had no safe outlet. His private world was nothing like the fantasy millions imagined. While fans pictured endless parties and carefree luxury, the reality inside Graceland was often lonely and troubled. Elvis would spend hours alone, wrestling with demons nobody else could see. He would stare at his own reflection as if looking at a stranger, wondering who he really was beneath all the expectations. He would retreat into silence, overwhelmed by the impossible task of being Elvis Presley every single day, without rest, without relief, without permission to simply be human. The emotional cost of maintaining the legend was destroying him slowly. Every public appearance mandated him to put on armor, to become the character everyone wanted him to be. Every interview demanded carefully chosen words that revealed nothing real. Every photograph mandated the perfect smile that showed no weakness. The constant performance exhausted him in ways sleep could never fix. He was tired of pretending, tired of hiding, tired of living a life that felt increasingly false. Priscilla watched all of this happen, powerless to stop it, desperate to help but unsure how. She became his safe harbor, the one person who saw him completely and still stayed. She held him when the weight became too much. She listened when he wanted to speak truths that could never leave their private space. She protected him from a world that would have destroyed him if they knew what he really struggled with. "I need you to promise me something," Elvis said to her one night, his voice breaking slightly. "If anything happens to me, don't let them make me into something I wasn't, but also don't tell them things they won't understand. They'll tear apart my memory. They'll make it ugly." That promise became Priscilla's burden to carry. She chose silence, not because she was ashamed of who Elvis really was, but because she understood the world was not ready for his truth. She knew that speaking openly would invite judgment, mockery, and misunderstanding that would hurt his legacy and his family. She knew the 1960s and 70s offered no framework for understanding the complexities of what Elvis experienced, so she stayed quiet, protecting him the only way she knew how. For decades, that silence felt like the right choice. She convinced herself that some truths were too dangerous to share, that protecting his image mattered more than revealing his reality. She told herself that the world did not need to know everything, that keeping his secrets was the final act of love she could offer him. But as years passed and the world slowly changed, Priscilla began questioning her decision. She watched society grow more understanding, more accepting, more willing to see public figures as complex human beings rather than perfect icons. She saw conversations happening that would have been impossible during Elvis's lifetime. She witnessed other families choosing honesty over protection, truth over legend, and finding that the world responded with compassion rather than condemnation. The weight she had carried for so long grew heavier with each passing year. The secret pressed against her heart, demanding release. She began wondering if her silence had truly honored Elvis, or if it had actually participated in the same system that made him suffer in the first place. Perhaps protecting the legend meant betraying the man. Perhaps the kindest thing she could do now was allow the world to know him completely, even the parts that once seemed too dangerous to reveal. Why had she chosen silence for so long when speaking might have helped others facing similar struggles? And what finally convinced her that the truth, no matter how complicated, deserved to be told? The confession that shook everything. Priscilla Presley had always been a woman of extraordinary gentleness. She moved through life with careful consideration, weighing her words before speaking them, thinking about how her actions might affect others. Her kindness was not weakness, but wisdom. But beneath that gentle exterior lived tremendous courage, the kind that grows quietly over years of bearing difficult truths alone. And now, after decades of silence, that courage was demanding to be heard. The decision did not come suddenly. It grew slowly, like dawn breaking after the longest night. Priscilla had carried Elvis's secret for so many years that it had become part of her, woven into her very being. She had promised to protect him, and she had kept that promise faithfully even after death separated them. But lately, something inside her had shifted. She began seeing her silence differently, not as protection, but as participation in the same shame that had made Elvis suffer while he lived. She thought about all the people who might be struggling with similar battles, feeling alone and frightened just as Elvis had been. She thought about young people hiding parts of themselves because society taught them those parts were wrong. She thought about families keeping secrets that poisoned them slowly from within. And she realized that perhaps the greatest way to honor Elvis was not to protect his image, but to reveal his humanity completely, honestly, courageously. When Priscilla finally decided to speak, her hands trembled slightly. Her voice carried the weight of years, but it also carried unmistakable determination. She was not doing this for attention or controversy. She was doing it because love sometimes demands truth, even when truth is painful, even when it changes how people see someone they thought they knew. Elvis struggled with parts of himself he was never allowed to acknowledge, she said. Her words measured but powerful. The world wanted him to be one thing, and he tried so hard to be that thing. But inside, he wrestled with feelings and thoughts that terrified him because he had been taught they were wrong. What the world had whispered about for years was finally being addressed directly, not by tabloids or gossip columnists, but by the woman who knew him best. Priscilla did not sensationalize or dramatize. She simply told the truth with compassion and understanding. She explained that Elvis had experienced attractions and feelings that did not fit neatly into the categories his era provided. He had questioned his own identity, struggled with aspects of his sexuality, battled with mental health challenges that had no name in his time. She spoke about nights when he confessed fears about his own mind, when he wondered if something was broken inside him. She described moments when he seemed lost between who he was expected to be and who he actually felt himself to be. She revealed that much of his pain came not from fame itself, but from the impossible task of hiding his true self while living under constant scrutiny. He wasn't confused or troubled because something was wrong with him, Priscilla explained, her voice gaining strength. He was troubled because the world told him his truth was shameful. He carried guilt and fear for feelings that were simply part of who he was. And that burden, that constant hiding, that exhausting pretense, it destroyed him slowly. The revelation was heartbreaking in its simplicity. Elvis was not just a star burning too bright. He was a vulnerable human soul trapped in circumstances that gave him no room to breathe, no space to exist authentically. He had achieved every worldly measure of success while losing himself completely in the process. The crown everyone celebrated had been crushing him all along. Priscilla's honesty sent shockwaves through everyone connected to Elvis's legacy. Family members had to reconsider memories they thought they understood. Friends replayed conversations in their minds, suddenly seeing layers of meaning they had missed before. Fans who had idolized him were forced to see him as more complex, more human, more real than the perfect image they had worshipped. Some people struggled to accept this new understanding. They wanted to keep Elvis exactly as they remembered him, frozen in the safe version that matched their memories. But others found themselves deeply moved by Priscilla's courage. They realized that this revelation did not diminish Elvis, but actually made him more remarkable. He had carried impossible weight with grace. He had given the world joy while battling private anguish. He had performed love and confidence while feeling neither for himself. Stories that once seemed straightforward now felt layered with hidden meaning. The songs took on new depth. The photographs revealed subtle sadness in eyes that smiled for cameras. The legacy transformed from simple celebration into something more profound, a testament to human complexity and the cost of living behind masks. What he wanted was understanding, not judgment, Priscilla continued, her words steady despite obvious emotion. He wanted permission to be fully himself without fear. He wanted a world that could hold his complexity with compassion. But that world did not exist for him then. Maybe it can exist now for others like him. Her revelation demanded something from everyone who had loved Elvis and everyone who had idolized him. It demanded they grow beyond comfortable myths. It demanded they acknowledge that the man they celebrated had suffered in ways they never imagined. It demanded honesty about how society's narrow expectations harm even those who seem most successful. It demanded recognition that true love means accepting people completely, not just the parts that fit our preferences. For those who truly loved Elvis, Priscilla's truth was a gift, an invitation to know him more deeply, to honor his memory more completely. For those who had only idolized the legend, it was a challenge to see him as human, flawed, struggling, real. What does this newfound truth demand from a world that placed impossible expectations on someone who only wanted to be accepted? And how many others suffered silently because Elvis never got the chance to speak his truth himself? The truth that set them both free. In the days and weeks following her revelation, Priscilla watched as the world processed what she had shared. Some reactions were difficult, filled with denial or discomfort, but many more were beautiful, filled with newfound understanding and appreciation. People began looking at Elvis differently, not with disappointment, but with deeper respect. They started recognizing that his struggles did not diminish his legacy, but rather enriched it, made it more meaningful, more relatable, more profoundly human. When I finally spoke the truth, Priscilla reflected quietly, I was terrified that people would turn away from his memory, but what actually happened was the opposite. They moved closer, they saw him more clearly, and they loved him more deeply because of it. The truth had not destroyed Elvis's image, as she had once feared. Instead, it had completed it. For decades, people had worshipped an incomplete picture, a carefully edited version that showed only strength and confidence and success. Now they were seeing the whole person, the complicated human being who experienced doubt and fear and confusion just like everyone else. And somehow, that made everything he accomplished even more remarkable. His music took on new layers of meaning when people understood the pain behind it. The vulnerability in his voice suddenly made perfect sense. The passion in his performances reflected someone fighting to express feelings he could not speak openly. The loneliness that sometimes showed in his eyes between smiles was no longer mysterious, but heartbreakingly clear. Elvis had poured his hidden self into his art, because art was the only safe place he had to be real. People started realizing that what they called his secret life was not shameful, but rather evidence of his incredible strength. He had carried burdens that would have destroyed most people, yet he continued showing up, performing, giving joy to millions even while suffering privately. He had lived in an era that offered him no support, no understanding, no permission to be himself, yet he found ways to survive and create beauty anyway. His struggles revealed not weakness, but extraordinary courage. Priscilla found unexpected peace in having finally shared the truth. For years, the secret had felt like a stone pressing against her chest, growing heavier with time. She had carried it out of love, out of loyalty, out of fear that speaking would cause harm. But now that the words had been released, she felt lighter than she had in decades. The burden she had thought would crush her if she let it go had actually been crushing her by staying silent. "I realized that protecting his image was not the same as protecting him," she said softly. "The image was a prison that hurt him when he was alive. Why would I keep maintaining that prison after his death? He deserves to be remembered as he truly was, with all his complexity and humanity intact." She began seeing her decision as an act of love more profound than silence had ever been. By speaking honestly, she was giving Elvis something he never had while living: permission to be fully known and still be valued. She was demonstrating that his worth was not dependent on fitting narrow expectations, that his legacy could withstand truth, that his memory was strong enough to hold his whole story. The healing that came from this honesty extended beyond just Priscilla. Family members who had sensed things but never spoken about them felt relief at finally naming what had always been present. Friends who had wondered about certain moments now had context that made everything make sense. And countless strangers who faced their own hidden struggles found comfort in knowing that even Elvis Presley, even the king himself, had wrestled with similar demons. His legacy became richer because of the truth, not despite it. Instead of a distant icon on an unreachable pedestal, Elvis became a symbol of human resilience. His story transformed into something that mattered in new ways. He represented not just talent and success, but the courage it takes to keep going when you cannot show the world your real face. He became proof that greatness and struggle can coexist, that someone can give tremendous gifts to the world while fighting private battles no one sees. "The secret life that I kept hidden for so long," Priscilla explained. Her voice, filled with emotion and certainty, was actually evidence of his strength, not his weakness. He lived authentically in the only ways available to him. He loved fiercely despite being taught that some kinds of love were wrong. He kept creating beauty even when he felt broken inside. That is not something to hide. That is something to honor. The story was closing now, not with tragedy, but with grace and understanding. Elvis's memory carried something new: honesty wrapped in compassion, truth delivered with love, complexity presented without judgment. Priscilla's courage in speaking had ensured that future generations would know him not as a perfect legend, but as a real person who mattered precisely because he was imperfect, because he struggled, because he was beautifully, painfully, courageously human. She had given Elvis what he could never give himself: the freedom to be fully known. And in doing so, she had given the world something precious too: permission to see that our heroes are most heroic not when they are flawless, but when they continue fighting despite their flaws, when they keep giving despite their pain, when they remain kind despite the cruelty of their circumstances. Now that the truth was finally out, carried forward with love and respect, one question remained: how would the world choose to remember Elvis Presley? As the untouchable king frozen in perfection, or as the vulnerable man who gave everything he had despite caring more than anyone knew? The answer would determine not just his legacy, but what kind of world we were becoming. Whether we could hold complexity with compassion, whether we could love people completely, whether we had finally learned that truth, delivered with kindness, always honors more than myth ever could.